We are ready to start sewing. I'm going to start with the lining. Now, the seam allowance in this pattern, unless stated, is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. For this lining piece, we start at 3/8, but then we taper to 5/8 or 1.6 centimeters. And the reason for that is that when this is put in, when the lining is stuffed into the exterior later on, because of the thickness of the seams, it will not fit nicely without wrinkles unless you have a larger seam allowance. So we're going to start with 3/8 and then move to 5/8. And you can see I tapered pretty quickly. I'm already at 5/8. And then as I approach the end, I go back, I taper again, and so I can end on 3/8. And I backstitch at the beginning and end. Then I trim my seams. I will also be sewing the curly toe and the high heel stocking as we go along, but I'm not going to show every step, especially if it's the same as the standard toe. So here's my curly toe lining. No, this is my high heel lining. This is my curly toe lining. They are sewn the same way. So you start with 3/8 of an inch and then go to 5/8 and then trim the seam, finish at 3/8. And then when you're done, you trim the seam. So these linings are the same no matter which style you're sewing. Now we're going to sew the exterior. I am not going to sew a stocking with piping today, but I'm going to show you how I would apply it if I were to do piping. The lip part always goes flush with the edge if you have a 3/8 of an inch lip. This one's a little less, so I might offset it from the edge just a little bit. However, I don't have it go all the way to the top. I do taper off the edge up here, and that part that it tapers off will be covered by the cuff, and it will keep the bulk out of the top seam. So if you are going to do piping around the whole stocking, now would be the step you put it in. Generally, I baste it to one side, and then I come back and I sandwich it between the two exterior pieces, and then I sew, and I use a zipper foot. But today I am just going to be sewing this without piping. So this is for the exterior, I use a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance for the whole way around. Okay, there's another thing that I do. It's not in the pattern, it's just something I like to do, and that's to sew around the exterior again with a little bit longer stitch length. And I do that for two reasons. One is that the finished product will have the seam like this, that can put a lot of stress on seams, and especially for some fabrics that I use, I feel like it's more secure with 2 layers of stitches. And the other reason is when we have these convex curves and we're clipping into them, I feel like it can weaken that seam, and so I like having it double stitched. So after I sew around it once, I like to sew around it a second time. And you don't have to, this is just something I like to do. Now I'm going to trim this seam in half. And on this version, there's really only one curve that I feel the need to clip. And so I put a few snips into this seam, this curve, to help it lay nicely later on. Oops, sorry. Let me get it in shot. But I clip up to the seam, up to the stitching, but not through it. Now, there's only been, usually I do not have to notch this outside curve. There's only been a few fabrics, maybe one that I can think of. I used vinyl, and I needed to do a lot of small notches in order to get this curve to lay nicely when it was turned right side out. But for most of my fabrics that I use, I just trim it like this, and then I turn it outside, right side out, and it sits just fine. But I do like to clip these concave curves. I am going to show you the, let me get them, the high heel and the curly toe. I'm going to show you how I sew those exteriors as well, so that you can see, because they are just a little bit more complicated than the standard. All right, I am sewing the high heel first. When I'm approaching a corner, I like to do a little back stitch, forward stitch, and then I pivot and do the same thing again. And I feel like that helps strengthen that corner. I do that even though I'm going to be coming around again a second time. It's just a quirk I've picked up, but I do feel like it helps the strength of that point. And now I will go around it again, second set of stitching like I like to do, but I'm not going to show you how I do that, just because you don't need to see me sew it a second time. But before I do that, I'm going to sew the curly toe now. Okay, now I'll keep going. When I get to this point, I generally do a little forward and back stitch just to strengthen this point on both sides of it, and then I keep going. Okay, now I'm going to sew around both of these again a second time and trim the seam, and then I will come back and show you how I notch the seams. Okay, so after I have sewn and trimmed this curly-toed stocking, I'm going to do little snips between right here where the curve starts and here where it ends. And I do them fairly close together, and I do them up to the curve. This is hard to do without running into my phone, my camera. I might want to make sure I don't cut through these stitches, but as it gets to be a smaller radius of this curve, I do them closer together. You still will get some wrinkling when you turn it right side out, especially because I have kind of thick fabric, but hopefully it won't be too bad. Whew. My hands are hurting. My scissors need to be sharpened. Okay, so you can see this seam now has a lot more flexibility to it. And then I will do the same thing on this inner seam here for the high heel, and then on this seam over, oop, let me get in the camera, this seam for here for the high heel. So I'll do that one first. Oops, sorry. I try to keep this on the camera. Okay, so that is ready to go. And then of course on these curves, I made sure to cut at an angle to the points so that they can hopefully stick out nicely. Maybe I'll do this one a little closer. And we're done sewing our exterior and our lining. Alright, now that we have finished sewing the lining and the exterior, we're going to turn our exteriors right side out. I like to use this little tool. It's got a point on one side and a curve on the other. And I use the curve part to push out the curves on the heel and toe of this stocking. So then you can iron it flat at this point. Here, I'm gonna move my, there, so you can see it a little better. You can iron it flat at this point. I usually don't. I wait to the end and iron it flat then, but you can iron it flat at this point. I am also going to turn right side out the high heel and the the curly-toed stocking. First, I've got to check these for some lint and other things that got, because these are light colored, and I want to make sure I remove any lint and other marks. These are a little hard to turn right side out because of the curves, and the high heel is a little hard to turn out right side out. I also picked a very thick fabric. This is an old bedspread. I thought would look nice. I do think it's going to look nice, but I think I'm going to struggle a little bit to get the high heel out. All right, first I'm going to get the toe. Everything except for this heel. I'm going to use the pokey edge to try to poke it out. This is a lot easier if you're using quilting cotton, but I'm doing a quilted bedspread as my fabric. Sorry, I keep moving it outside of the view of the camera. I will try to stop doing that. Okay, and that's pretty good. All right, I've got my high heel. Let's look at it from this side. Yeah, it looks nice. And then my curly toe, which usually is not quite as bad as the high heel. Okay, looks like I've got to poke this one out a bit too. I might not be able to get it as pointy as if I'd used cotton. One thing that's kind of fun to do is with these curly toes is to add a little bell at the end. I've done that for my kids and husband. Okay. That works pretty well. Okay. So, before the two different kinds of stockings with the cuff and without the cuff, before we diverge, there's one more step that's the same for both, and that's making the hanger. So I am going to do that now. Okay, so this is the hanger for the medium stocking. It's 2 inches by 5 inches, and generally what I do is I fold it in half. Then I open it up and I fold each edge in to meet that middle. And then I fold it in half again. Now, something I like to do is to reinforce it, if it's a very thin fabric like this, with ribbon. So I will fold it in half And then I will take some grosgrain ribbon that's about the same length, and I will match it up with that middle seam, fold the fabric over to cover it and the other fabric over to meet it, and then fold it in half again. And then I will sew it. I always lengthen my stitch for this because it's going through so many layers. And there I have a hanger loop. The other thing that I do, because I sew with a lot of velvet and it's thick, is like I mentioned at the beginning, I cut this out a half an inch narrower than the width. If you're using a larger size, I just cut off a quarter of the width. And then I fold it into thirds, like that. And then I sew it that way. And when I attach this to the stocking, I just put that raw edge on the inside, and you can't see it, you can't tell, and it makes it a little less thick.